thanks for inviting me. So the main purpose of this presentation is to talk about dynamic pattern synthesis, which is a mixed method that I'm developing, which incorporates cluster analysis and qualitative comparative analysis. It's trying to combine them. So it's unique in that sense, but it's building on a lot of work that's been done before. Now, in this presentation, there's quite a lot of theoretical background material in terms of complexity, which I'll whiz through because we've got limited time to get onto the particulars of the method. Maybe you come back to some of that later. So, just quickly, social media. This is the Twitter handle, isn't it, for the CECAN project? That's my Twitter handle, and then these are quite useful hashtags. I'm trying to get the hashtag DPS going, if anybody wants to say anything on that. These are general ones that are used a lot, which get quite a lot of feedback, complexity and methods. So if you're into Twitter, great, and keep the discussion going. I'm afraid I don't do Facebook anymore. Having had 3 children and become adults, I've had to give up with them. Defeated. So I do Twitter, but I don't do Facebook. So the structure, as I said, I'll whiz through the methodology. I'm not for the moment going to highlight much on the methodology, the kind of theoretical background in complexity theory and how it fits with this method. I can return to that if you want me to at the end. The essential bit of this presentation is the method. What is dynamic pattern synthesis? And giving you a working example, which is a macro-political economy example. And then just some conclusions about where I'm going with developing the method. Okay. So, definitions of complex systems. It's actually quite difficult to pin down some of the concepts in complexity theory. One or two definitions I think are particularly good. I particularly like Paul Cecilia's definition in his book Complexity and Postmodernism. So he talks about cases and elements, and in terms of my research method, I'm taking cases to be people, organisations, countries, elements, perhaps more the kind of physical infrastructure in society. Dynamic interactions right at the heart of complex systems, so the interactions between people, organisations and countries. The fact that in complex systems the cases are responding to limited information, so they don't know everything, they don't have access to all information. Now we of course live in an information society where there's incredible amounts of information and information is getting shared in quite extraordinary new ways, but nevertheless there is a limit to the amount of any information that anybody has at any one time in that system, which is quite a critical point. The essential nature of the interaction, the communication, positive and negative feedback. We have to be careful about positive and negative feedback in social science, in terms of the value base. So a lot of authors talk about it in terms of reinforcing feedback and checking feedback. And that's obviously really important in a policy situation, in terms of we get these behaviour patterns that are repeated and they perhaps take off exponentially. And then policy is often about checking things and trying to balance things and to find effective ways of doing that. So patterns of interaction right at the heart of all this. Massive discussion in complex systems theory about the degree to which systems are open or not. That's a different presentation, but it's a fascinating area in terms of how open are these systems, where are they closed. Dynamic flows of energy, and then history, a really important point in terms of social systems. All systems to some extent are defined by their history, so the idea of path dependency. And a source of much stability in a world which often is unstable comes from this kind of historical basis of these systems. So that's a definition that I particularly like at the front end of Paul Cecilia's book. I mean, it runs into 2 pages. I've just paraphrased it and summarised it down. One of the better ones, I think, in terms of social science. So I'm going to whiz through some of this background stuff so we get onto the method. So we think about the method of evaluating a complex system. We're effectively evaluating a moving scene. I mean, everything is moving around all the time. It's not static, it's highly dynamic. And so context is incredibly important. And the kind of debate going on with the critical realists in method is exactly how important is context? How much can we isolate mechanisms? And there's interesting debate and dialogue going on about that. But basically, people like myself will say the context is incredibly important. And that's the really difficult bit to get hold of. Any mechanism that we can isolate, it's always subject to time and space limitations, contextual limitations. So that's the huge challenge that we face. Problems with variable research. I think Brian talked about this in the last presentation. We're running into problems now with traditional statistical variable-based approaches in terms of central tendency, probability of deviation. Basically, these are giving us too much of a kind of static picture of the world in which we're working in. So we need something that can enable us to get more sense of dynamics. Hence the attraction with case-based research. Dynamic pattern synthesis is a case-based approach. It's drawing on previous case-based approaches. This is about holding on to the case, not just looking at traces of variables, thinking about similarity and differences of cases, and looking at patterns of people, organisations, societies, how they change over time. So time is critically important. Arguably, just taking some research cross-section at one point in time is of very limited value. Longitudinal research incredibly important in terms of seeing how things move around, how the relationships change between things. So we're very much sitting in here in terms of dynamic pattern synthesis. So scientific prediction, limited. Our ability to get to cause and effect is always going to be limited. Maybe temporary forecasting. We're going to be undermined by time and space effects. Mechanisms that we can find are time limited. We're talking about a lot of interaction with a dynamic context. However, it's not perhaps over here. Chaos, very short-term observations, hardly any cause and effect. We could talk about probabilities. If we're looking at things like civil wars, very unstable situations, we're trying to intervene there. It's really impossible to talk about cause and effect going forward, but we may be able to think about probabilities with different approaches. Mechanisms, if there are any, incredibly short-term. So, in here it's a little bit better. We might discover some stability. We will find some stability, some stable patterns in this very dynamic environment. Okay, so moving on to the method. What is dynamic pattern synthesis? So very much in this area here, this is where a method like dynamic pattern synthesis is targeted to get into this complex area, this complex dynamic area. So we're seeking to identify patterns in data sets. We're not looking at the starting point with a direct hypothesis of cause and effect, X causes Y. We're looking for patterns, that's the starting point. The data sets in themselves can be relatively simple. You don't have to have an incredibly complicated, complex data set. Of course, there's lots of discussion at the moment about dealing with complex data sets, huge data sets. In fact, the idea of dynamic pattern synthesis is actually to start with a fairly simple data set, because with a fairly simple data set, with a small matrix, there's actually a huge number of potential possible patterns. It's one of the things that we know from Reagan's work with QCA. There's actually, in a matrix, there's a huge number of patterns. So the idea is to start with actually a fairly simple data set to discover some patterns that we can feel fairly confident about. And then it's very easy to then scale this method up, so then replicate it with a slightly different sample, a later time, to build around it, perhaps at different levels. So that's the argument that I'm making. So we're assuming these complex interactions are there, that there aren't very easy, simple finds. So is this method qualitative or quantitative? Well, I think it, in the tradition of Charles Reagan's approach to qualitative comparative analysis, it sits really between the two. I suppose you could say it's a bit more quantitative than qualitative. But interestingly, it's using quantitative data really for a very qualitative purpose, I think. It's exploratory, it's exploring interactions. I think it has to be over time. And it's using quantitative measures to make robust qualitative decisions. So I think it sits between the two methods. So the point with sampling, I'm arguing that you start fairly small in a focused way, but then you can scale around that. You can quickly then develop that research with further smaller samples. So this is not the traditional idea of sampling in terms of sampling of inference from a big population at all. It's about a purposeful sample of a particular area of policy. So, for example, if you're looking at local authorities, some of the work I've done is looking at local authorities. You start with outer London boroughs or inner London boroughs. You start with a reasonably coherent group, which you can get to grips with a set number of variables. You don't go in too big too quickly, so that you can manage all these interactions and all these possibilities. So, where dynamic pattern synthesis is original and unique is it combines cluster analysis with qualitative comparative analysis. So it starts with hierarchical cluster analysis, ideally of a scale-based data set. So you're getting the full range of scale of the variables. You're not, at that point, reducing the data. And you use that to explore the data and then to hypothesize about the number of possible clusters or groups within that data. You then test the number of clusters with QCA, where you can get much more control over the variable effects on the clusters, as we'll see. And then you start to theorise about what those patterns are that you're seeing between the variables and the clusters. What do they represent? So you repeat this over several time points. I would argue the minimum would be 3 time points. And then you can start to also theorise about the longitudinal patterns, where the stability is in terms of patterns, where there's change, where there's movement. And the other thing I'm trying to do with my work is develop a typology of stability and instability as I compare these studies as I do them, getting a sense about how in different situations you get different patterns of stability and instability. So we start dynamic pattern synthesis with cluster analysis. So you select a suitable number of comparable cases, and I would encourage people to start with actually a fairly small number of cases. So the example I'm going to use today, macro political economy, is the 12 original Euro countries. And then you need a reasonably consistent, ideally variable database of scale variables. So obviously something like political economy, there's lots of potential variables there that are collected every year that you can use. So at least 3 time points. And I noticed one of the questions that's come through was, what size sample should you have? Well, it's a kind of, it's not a precise answer, but personally the way that I'm developing this method, I don't really like working initially with samples bigger than 50. I'd much rather scale the thing up, having made a start with a small sample, then add to it. If I've got something coherent to say about outer London boroughs, then I'll bring in inner London boroughs and see. So I would really put the emphasis perhaps more qualitatively in terms of sampling, in terms of having a purpose. Hello, yeah.
So are you saying that N is the number of countries or the number of variables?
That would be the number of cases actually there. Okay, sorry, number of cases, not variables. Okay, this is cases. So yeah, there'd be number of countries. Yeah, okay. So I would suggest starting with a small number of cases. Thanks for that question. So with cluster analysis is designed to classify cases rather than to model an outcome. So you don't have an independent variable and a dependent variable. It's about classifying cases into similar groups on the basis of similarity and difference. There's obviously a variety of algorithms potentially available within cluster analysis, which in itself is fairly complex, which I won't attempt to go into today. But it's something important to be aware of, that there are different algorithms, and you will get slightly different patterns depending on the algorithm that you use to calculate the distance and similarities. Now you can use cluster analysis potentially nowadays with a fairly large n of variables now rather than clusters. So you can put lots of variables in terms of trying to see what a holistic influence on cases is of lots of variables at the same time. Where we have to be careful, and I guess it's part of my caution about the number of cases and not trying to start too big, is it's very easy with these kind of methods to generate mathematical artifacts, which, real mathematical patterns in terms of the calculations, but they haven't got any social science meaning, and you can't really interpret them qualitatively. It used to be a problem with factor analysis when people started out with factor analysis. You get these amazing 10 factors and all this, but actually, if you think about it in terms of the questions and what you're doing, very few of them are actually really of any benefit or real meaning. So I do think it's better to start out more qualitatively in terms of the purpose of this, with relatively small approaches. So the particular cluster analysis method I've been using here is hierarchical cluster analysis. It makes no prior hypothesis about the number of clusters, a small number of cases. The example we'll look at, there's only 12. And I use the agglomerative approach in terms of it assumes all cases are unique at the starting point and then tries to group them, which logically I think is right for cases like countries. So then after that, I would then use QCA to examine the groupings that have been suggested by the cluster analysis. I use crisp set QCA to begin to understand how the variables are affecting the cluster and to check out that actually these clusters are real, that they're meaningful in terms of social science, that they aren't just mathematical patterns. Of course, there are other forms of QCA that you can use. So, to move on to the example. So this is macro political economy. A lot of the work that I've done in recent years and published has looked at comparing welfare states in Europe and elsewhere, so at the kind of country macro level. I've also done work comparing local authorities and local government. I've done less work comparing individual people, but I'm beginning to try and experiment with this now in terms of how effective it is or not, in terms of actually looking at differences between individual people. So most of the work done so far has compared either at the organisational level or at the national level. So this study looks at Euro member countries, the 12 countries that joined the Euro initially in 2002. So 12 cases. Oh, something there. Okay, so there's 13 variables in here. I won't go through them individually because of time, but they're pretty standard macroeconomic variables that you'd expect for this sort of study. So the hierarchical cluster analysis, it uses Ward's method, which is a algorithm which seems to be preferred a lot by people doing these kind of comparative policy approaches. It tends towards tighter clustering in terms of its bias. And the variables have been standardised. That's because they weren't all percentages of GDP. Some of them are ratio type scores. So the decision made was to standardise them. You don't have to standardise them. But that prevents one variable from having too much influence on the model. So then the cluster analysis produces a dendrogram in terms of the measurement of similarity and difference. So over on the left here, we're getting the initial groupings coming through. Okay, so we've got some groupings of countries emerging here. We've got France, Germany, and the Netherlands. You see France and Germany are linked very strongly. This is 2002. Austria, Finland, a group here, Austria, Finland, Belgium. Ireland and Spain. Luxembourg is always an outlier. Greece, Portugal, and Italy. So we're getting some groupings which kind of, they logically make sense. They don't look ridiculous. So that's good news. So we've got an initial cluster result for 2002 from the 13 variables, 12 countries, 13 variables.
Can we ask you this point?
Yeah.
Did you try the same cluster analysis with different variables just to see how stable they are? How much does it depend on the choice of the variables?
It will depend on the choice of variables, absolutely.
Did you test the robustness of the choice of the variables?
Not specifically in this example, I don't think, but I'm reasonably confident because they're such mainstream political economy variables. I've done quite a lot of other related work, I mean, we'll look in a minute to see how they move over time. I mean, that might raise some of those issues where if you use different variables, that might change that a little bit. Mm-hmm. But in terms of the central clusters, I don't think they would change hugely.
Which is why I asked, because whichever way you cut it, you always come with the same groupings, which is why I wanted to see whether there's something...
Yeah, no, and that's a good point. I mean, in the ideal world, social science research, you would always be replicating and trying something a bit different. That's what I say to my students. Of course, I don't do it myself all the time. Lack of time. Yeah, I was going on at my students about replication last week. Okay, so... Or did I explain the last one? So, QCA. So with QCA, what we do is allocate for each variable with each case, using the original scale data, we make a judgment about a threshold point, and then we allocate a simple binary score, 1 or 0. Okay, so it's effectively a qualitative decision. Essentially, it's guided by the central tendency, and then we allocate a 0 or a 1 to each variable to each case. And this is where we go into the world of QCA. And then, effectively, a cluster can have something called a primary implicant, which is where everybody in the cluster shares the same threshold for that variable. So, for example, if we've got a grouping, the Netherlands, Germany, and France, they're all, in 2002, those more kind of advanced economies were coming out of a mini recession, and so their GDP growth was below threshold. Now, these above-below threshold scores are relative to the group of countries, okay? I mean, you could apply them as absolutes. You could apply an absolute, but this is done as a relative, so they're relative to each other. So here, these three countries, relative to the 12, have got a low GDP growth at that point in time, okay? So that's an illustration of a primary implicant. Now, you can't see this, but these are all the scale scores for the 12 countries. Okay, that's your scale score matrix that went into the cluster analysis. So they're all scale variables. And then here we've used the mean and the median. Obviously also had access to the standard deviation to make a decision about the threshold score. So there you're seeing the QCA type input, the ones and the zeros. So if we zoom into a little bit of that, just to be clear on the threshold decision. So here we've got 3 countries on their percentage of the working age population employed, and we're making a decision from the scale data, looking at the mean and the median, to give a threshold conversion. So Austria and Finland are getting 1, they're up in the 70s in terms of employment, over 70%. Belgium is well down below 70%, so that's getting a 0. Okay, so that's how we're applying the threshold settings. So when you put all this together, this is the typical Charles Reagan what he calls a truth table. I'm never quite sure why he called it a truth table, but he did. So in the old-fashioned idea of QCA, you'd often have an outcome variable. Well, the outcome variable here is the cluster memberships that we got from the cluster analysis. Okay, and then we've got our pattern going across with our binary crisp set scores for each variable. So the first thing we can do is say, well, how robust are the clusters that came from the cluster analysis? Are there enough primary implicants in terms of variable patterns to actually make the cluster stand up? Okay, and this is one of the benefits of using both of the methods. It's making it a bit more robust in terms of those kind of decisions. So in bold, you have got the primary implicants, where the groups of countries are sharing the same variable overall score. Okay, so the clusters are coming out as reasonably robust, 2002. So this is how the method works. So if we just zoom in on, again, the Netherlands, Germany, France. In yellow, you've got the primary implicants running across there. So we've got the one we looked at before, low GDP. We've got low government current account, high productivity. We can run across and just see where they've got shared political economy characteristics. And then we can summarise that in Boolean algebra. There are different notations for this. This is just use a very simple one where you write below threshold score in lowercase or above threshold score in capitals. It does result in rather long-winded approaches, so you can obviously summarise these down to first letters or something. So there we have a simplification statement about these main variable relationships in each cluster. And just zooming in on, again, the Netherlands, Germany, France, cluster 1. It's easier to see what's going on. So things that are coming above threshold, productivity, Migration, working migration is higher. So again, these are relative to the 12 countries. Relative to the 12 countries. They're not absolutes. They're relative to the 12 countries.
Because what is GDP? Is it growth or level?
That is annual GDP growth. That one. Yeah. So then we repeat all this for 3 time points. So what you just saw was 2002. We're going to go on and look at 2006 and 2013. So here we have our dendrogram for 2006, and you begin to see a little bit of movement going on between some of the clusters. Effectively what you see over the 3 years is northern countries tending to stay together, southern countries tending to stay together, but a little bit of coming and going in the detail. Okay, that's basically overall what happens across the 3 years. You will see it all together at the end, I promise. So one thing I'm also suggesting as a qualitative judgment, the more I play around with this, is when you get larger clusters, and then you sometimes get these very close primary implicants, where just one country is missing. Okay, so here we've got 3 countries now in 2006 that are doing better on GDP, but the Netherlands is a little bit behind. I'm applying this idea of near misses, that you can make a qualitative judgment, you can look at that specific score, and actually if it's very close to the mean or the median, then you could overrule that and say, well, we'll make that primary implicant. So that is a qualitative decision, rather than just applying a pure mathematical rule. So for example, if I do that here, the Netherlands is getting pretty close to the mean median in terms of annual GDP growth, so I made a decision, qualitative decision, I'm going to make that a primary implicant and say that actually that is quite a common characteristic between those countries at that point in time, that the GDP is getting towards above average. So then again we have our overall simplification of what's going on in the different clusters. If we just zoom in on cluster 1 now, where we've got Germany, Austria, Finland and the Netherlands. Higher unemployment, higher GDP, low inflation, higher export-import ratio, also higher on the per person GDP, low on state control of regulation, of business, low on interest rates, long-term interest rates. So we're getting a pattern coming through for that cluster there for 2006. Then in 2013, of course, we have the financial crisis in between. So this is the final year I applied to this particular study. We're looking now coming out of the financial crisis. It's been a long coming out, hasn't it? But beginning to come out of the financial crisis. So what was particularly interesting with this study was the difficulties this creates for the notion of convergence. I mean, this study illustrates that convergence basically isn't taking place, that you still have got this fairly stark division between northern European countries and southern European countries. And I said, well, you might get a little bit of moving around. Fundamentally, in terms of the main clusters and groupings, countries get rather stuck despite the change in variable scores. So now Greece, because its scale data is getting quite extreme in terms of its problems, is becoming an outlier. Okay, and Italy and Spain that were kind of pulling away in 2006 with more buoyant economies are now kind of back in that southern European group. So then, of course, we can create our truth table to see what's happening with the variables. If we just zoom in to a bit of that, then there's the Boolean simplification. So now we've got this interesting grouping, 2013, Ireland, Spain, Italy and Portugal, sharing quite a lot of characteristics. So lower relative employment, lower GDP growth, lower inflation. They are beginning to export more than they import. That's actually not doing so well on government current accounts. It's not really low government current account. High government debt, low productivity, low investment, higher long-term interest rates because of the problems with the financial crisis, making money more expensive. So we can see not just the clusters, but we can see how the clusters relate to what's happening with variables in relation to all the countries together.
Maybe technical question.
Yeah.
Long-term interest rate, given
Yeah.
you consider to be long-term interest rates for this group?
I took the European Bank definition of long-term interest rates, which is related to the 10-year government bonds. Okay. So, the final DPS, dynamic pattern synthesis. So we've done the separate years. Now we have to kind of bring it all together, really exciting bit. So there's 3 stages to that. We can put the dendrograms next to each other just to see that movement in the cluster analysis. We can plot a thing called a longitudinal truth table, where we actually look to see which countries hold the same variable thresholds across the whole 3 years. And then we can also look at separately the variable averages over the 3 years. So there's 3 different things, bits of information we can look at, and then we have to try and conclude and theorise about what on earth's going on. So here we have the 3 dendrograms next to each other, 2002, 2006, 2013. Okay. So within that we can see the overall pattern of Southern Europe and the more Northern European countries. And it's interesting in terms of where there are bits of movement. Italy, of course, is quite fascinating because it almost gets out of Southern Europe, and then it's kind of back in Southern Europe again after the financial crisis. In terms of its economic profile. Then we've got sort of things, Ireland and Spain are kind of separate. You know, they were sort of the so-called tiger economies in New Europe. But then after the financial crisis, getting into more difficulties. So we're getting now a sense of the overall picture. Here we are just looking at variable change over the time span, over the 3 years. Okay? So these are the mean average scores for the 12 countries each year. So it's just visually looking at which direction the variable trend is going in. So actually, as we'd expect, because of the financial crisis, there's quite a lot of instability in the variables. Okay, so decline in annual GDP growth. The great achievement, arguably, of the euro, the decline in inflation, but at what cost with all these other things. Massive increase in government debt, total government debt. Decline in productivity overall. Much more movement coming through in terms of the EU workforce, migrant movement of workforce between European countries. And then this consumer confidence improves in the middle section when the economies were most buoyant, but then drops really quite dramatically. So now we're just very simply seeing overall what was going on in the variables for the 12 countries. So we've got a lot of instability in the variables, but surprising perhaps amount of stability in terms of where countries stay in relation to each other. So we can now compute our longitudinal truth table. So what's happening here is we get a below or above in the cell if it's consistent over the 3 years. Okay? So Spain has a below here next to employment. So that means for all 3 years, Spain is below the threshold for the number of people employed in the working age population. Okay? So if there's an empty cell, it means there was movement. There was instability. It wasn't the same. And this allows us just to recheck the kind of what's happening with the clusters over the full period of time, 2002, 2013. In terms of looking for the pattern. So this was basically an Excel sort, just to check out the kind of ordering of these things, where the main patterns are. So Ireland kind of almost becomes a bit of an outlier over time on its own, but we've got the Southern European grouping up here sharing quite a lot of these characteristics. Long-term primary implicants, so low GDP per person, low productivity, low customer confidence, consumer confidence. So that is just zooming in on the Southern European cluster with the 3 main primary implicants across time. So, for the 4 Southern European countries particularly, they share over time, over the period of the study, lower GDP growth per person, lower productivity, lower consumer confidence. They're also likely to have more regulation and higher long-term interest rates. The exception there is Spain, which is why there wasn't a shared primary implicant with all of those countries on the longitudinal table. So what are the conclusions from the study overall in terms of this macro political economy study? Well, I'm arguing the cluster membership is actually in many ways remarkably stable, although there is some movement around over time, given how unstable the variables are and the financial crisis. What's happening is that countries, by and large, are staying together in similar types of patterns. And arguably this is because the crisis actually makes it more difficult for any idea of convergence. And we see the importance of neighbours, which is a common theme in complexity theory and complexity approaches, that whether you're looking at the individual level, the organisational level, the country level, you tend to be more similar to the people you're near to, as a kind of general concept. So the crisis for the overall system increases the differences. It actually, if anything, there's a bit of divergence rather than convergence. Of course, the great idea of the euro was convergence, that the countries will become economically more alike. So other options, that's a working example of DPS. So other options, you can use one variable as an outcome when you go into the QCA stage. We could have used GDP annual change as an outcome variable. That's very easy to do. I just used the outcome variable as the clusters. I was just confirming the clusters all the time. But you can switch things around. You can pick one of those variables and say, well, I'm particularly interested actually in looking at this as well. You can pick any one variable and track it in the QCA stage as an outcome variable. You can use at that point additional categorical variables in the traditional QCA way. So if you want to look at types of political institutions, which you wouldn't measure with a scale variable, you might have a couple of types in terms of type of democracy, democratic government or something. You can put that in. So you can add additional categorical variables at that stage if you want to. So you can obviously check any cluster relationship with a chosen outcome. That is possible. I haven't illustrated that today. So one of the things I'm particularly interested in as I do these kind of studies is to kind of get more of a sense about this notion of instability and stability, particularly in policy situations, because it's something that I've become quite fascinated with in complexity theory, is this kind of paradox between stability and instability. So in the book, where I do a number of these studies and try to draw general conclusions, this study we've just looked at will be here. Clusters are actually, I'm arguing, are quite resilient there. The country groupings are actually fairly resilient. Not necessarily in a positive way. Resilience isn't always a good thing. It's like if your kids are hanging out with the wrong people. They may carry on hanging out with the wrong people. They may say, well, it's resilient, I've got the same friends. I might not be too happy about it. So resilient isn't necessarily a positive thing there. But there's a lack of change, arguably, in the cluster memberships. Although lots of variable instability. So unstable variable pattern, stable case pattern. But I'm looking at other examples. So the one up here with some other research where variables are stable, the case pattern is unstable. So the reverse of what we just looked at. And then down here when both are unstable. So cases keep changing clusters and the variable trends are unstable as well. So I'm kind of trying to get a sense about different social science situations where you get different types of patterns, and that's something that I've written up with some different examples, some organisational, one that's actually individual, looking at individual people. In the book, which is coming out in the summer, Social Synthesis, Finding Dynamic Patterns in Complex Social Systems. So, arguably in social systems dynamics, causality is about relative interactions rather than stable mechanics. It's really quite a different approach to the idea of causality. And that if we find interactions that seem quite mechanistic, how stable are they in different places, different contexts, and different times? So what degree of confidence can we have when we find these partial mechanisms? We need, I'm arguing in terms of synthesis, we need a broad overview. We need to be quite careful about narrowing our research to more traditional ideas of causality and independent effects on causality. Of course, there's a place for every type of research. I'm not arguing we should never do that sort of research. But I think in a lot of these kind of policy situations, particularly macro policy, comparing organisations, we do need to have more sense about finding these interactive patterns because there's many potential things that will influence. Okay, that's it basically in terms of things I thought it was appropriate to present. I don't know if there's any questions. I know some questions